Good morning. Today I want to talk to you about our second summative task, which is the 20th century New World Order source analysis. You can see the document in front of you. This is of course downloaded from the tasks section of DAMAP, summative task 2. Questions. There are 6 questions there. We're asked to identify a key fact in the first question. The second asks us for opinions, and opinions differ from facts, of course, and are subtly more complex, subjective. In the third question, asks us about how useful a certain type of sources, in this case infographics, charts, graphs, tables. You and I know this as non-continuous writing, in other words. It also includes things like posters. Question 4 is a very common type of question you'll get in a source analysis, and it asks to what extent do sources 4, 5 and 6 support each other in the discussion of the BRICS countries. Now remember, whenever you encounter a question asking to what extent or to what degree, you must discuss both similarities and differences, not only where they coincide, but also where they differ. Question 5 asks us to analyse 2 sources, 2 and 5 in this case, to assess the strengths and limitations in each if we are specifically researching the New World Order. And finally, in question 6, and you'll always get this as the last question in the source analysis, it gives you an idea or an opinion and then asks you to go through all of the sources and say how does each contribute or not contribute to the idea. In this case, the idea being raised is that the New World Order will bring economic growth and cooperation for the global community. Now remember, with each of these questions, when you refer to the sources, always use information or quotes from the source itself to support your answer. Let's make a start. According to source 1, we're working on question 1 now. According to source 1, what was the key uniting element of the BRICS group? So if we look at source number 1, we're looking for uniting, and we can find it quite simply in the first paragraph. A key uniting element was often overlooked, and the element was that all 4 countries had global ambitions. Okay, they wanted to become major recognised powers in the world. Simple question. That's why you often find that the first question is only worth 1 mark. Question 2. What 2 opinions are expressed by President Bush about the New World Order in source number 2? Now this is from another speech. Remember, we watched the video of President George Bush after the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. We watched him speaking to a group of soldiers, airmen actually. Now we're going to see what he says to the Congress. Now here you're asked to find opinions. Now, opinions are subjective. In other words, they cannot be proven. They represent a view that one person holds. It might be a popular view, it might be unpopular. So I'm going to find one for you, but then I'm going to leave you to find the other one. And I found one already, and remember, this is something that cannot be proven or measured or identified in something like a photo. And here we go. We Americans, part of something larger than ourselves, for 2 centuries, we've done the hard work of freedom. And tonight, we lead the world in facing down a threat to decency and humanity. Now, this is an opinion. The whole idea of being something larger than ourselves up here. This is an emotive statement. It talks about how we want to feel about ourselves. It's not provable, and there is no fact. Again, for 2 centuries, we've done the hard work for freedom. Well, hard work for freedom is a very vague phrase. And for the Americans, 200 years of doing that, it could be argued that some countries do not see what the Americans have done from 1791 to 1991 as leading hard work of freedom. Some may say view, certainly some of America's enemies, that America did not lead a war for freedom, but reduced freedom. And here we have an American president saying, we lead the world in facing down a threat to decency and humanity. Very vague statement, very subjective. Not everyone considers that the Americans necessarily lead the world, and certainly in facing threats to humanity. Any side would say that the enemy is a threat to humanity. It doesn't matter what the opinion is, what the position is. All countries have a belief that they are doing the right thing. So those last three sentences in paragraph 1 of source 2, definitely opinion. There are other opinions? Definitely there are many more in here. Okay, ideas like worthy of our struggle and worthy of our children's future. Again, an opinion or a view. Look at some of the claims against the then Iraqi president Saddam Hussein and some of the language used to describe him. Again, opinion, and violated everything that the community of nations hold dear. What is a community of nations? There is no such thing. We're talking about the United Nations, and nations hold dear. Nations, like people, hold many different things dear. Again, opinion. And here we have the end of the Cold War has been a victory for all humanity. Well, not necessarily. Not everyone benefited from the end of the Cold War. And of course, what that does is by saying it's a victory for all humanity, it assumes that all humans are in the Western camp, in the NATO camp. And not all people in the world would have felt like that. And you only need to consider the BRICS countries, which were a group of nations that stood separate from both sides in the Cold War. I want to move on to question 3 now. In relation to source 3, how useful are infographics, charts, graphs, and tables as sources for historians conducting historians researching historical events? Well, this is source 3, and you can see it as an infographic will probably be the best description of it. Let's go through where it is useful. Well, what are some ideas? Well, it highlights information very easily. So you're not reading pages and pages of information. You can see it's all been selected and taken out and placed there for you. So it is quick and accessible, easy to access this information. You don't need as much literacy skill and you don't need as much time, which is an advantage for anyone, including historians. It also presents the information in a visual form. And you can see there the image, and also we have the structure, the lining up of information, under headings, and all of this together allows a historian to better understand the sequence. So what you'll generally find is from largest to smallest. You'll find things grouped in types: land vector as in land weapons, air vector as in weapons carried by aircraft, and sea vector, nuclear weapons carried by nuclear submarines and probably destroyers. So the layout and the use of images and the structuring of the information under headings, in sequences, and divided into groups. This makes all the information in an infographic or a table or a poster or a chart much more accessible to historians. And also, of course, the range of fonts and colours also separates information, again, making it easier to process. But it's not all plain sailing. There are problems with this type of information. In other words, there is limited detail. And I'll give you an example. Source 3 states that Russia has more nuclear weapons, more nuclear warheads than the US. And you see there 6,850 to 6,450. Can an historian, 20 years in the future, rely on this information? I don't think so. Because what this infographic, because it doesn't have the detail we need, doesn't tell us is that the US warheads, and there are fewer of them, may have twice the destructive yield or the capacity of the Russian warheads. And the French ones may have 1,000 times more destructive power. So these numbers don't necessarily tell the full story of the destructive power of these sites. Furthermore, this is what we call an amalgam of information, an aggregate. In other words, someone has gone through a number of primary and secondary sources in order to compile this information. As an historian, can we trust information, or do we always need to cross-check it? And of course, cross-checking is the key. And therefore, when I'm confronted with this as a serious historian, it looks helpful, but at the same time, it's frustrating because I know that I cannot use anything here until I have gone and checked all of these sources. And as I've said, this is an aggregate document. In other words, the sources could have come from many places. So by bringing it all together, the publisher of this material has not necessarily provided me an effective historical source. I want to move on to question 4 now. Sources 4, 5 and 6. To what extent? Now remember, to what extent means to what extent do they support each other, but also to what extent do they differ? These are the 3 sources. 4, which is an article from CNBC in 2019, talking about how the BRICS states were supposed to take over the global economy, and obviously something happened. It didn't occur. Look at the document. It tells us basically that they were grouped together, that the whole idea of BRICS was a marketing ploy by an American commercial bank called Goldman Sachs. In the early days of the BRICS alliance, all the countries, now that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and later South Africa, performed well. In 2010, South Africa joined the groups. They went from controlling 20% of the world's GDP to 30% in just 10 years, which is impressive. And China and India grew exponentially. In other words, they multiplied in terms of their economic power. However, countries like Brazil and Russia, which were reliant on coal and oil and gas and wood prices, basically to earn their income, were also working well. However, when prices for wood and oil and gas began to drop, we see a split in the BRICS countries. China and India are still growing because they relied on technology and service industries. Russia and Brazil struggled because they have relied on resources which are less valuable. Countries around the world are willing to pay less. Then we have the mixed fortunes of the BRICS. Now I want to go straight to the overlap. So stage and get straight into it. Where do the sources, there's source 4, and there is source 6, which is a table. Okay, sources 4 and 5 identify who the BRICS nations are. You can quite see that clearly here. China, India, Brazil, and Russia. And then South Africa in 2010. And the document here, source number 5, supports that by giving us the names of the nations within the BRICS groups. However, source 6 does not tell us which of these nations are BRICS groups. So there is some divergence already. 4 and 5 give certain information. 6 does not support that information. All sources support the idea that in the early 2000s, the economic power of China and Brazil and India rose. And we saw that here, where we saw that growth of 10% of the world's trade in only 10 years. And then when we come down here, we see a similar situation with people in Brazil moving from poverty in about the same period in the early 2000s. And we also see that from the 1990s through to 2012, we see growth in Russia. So they do support each other, that these two nations experienced growth, but they also support each other in the decline, which came from after 2007 or 2010, we start to see a decline. Now, if we have a look at the chart, does the chart support 4, 5 and 6? It's quite interesting. If we look at source 6, Russia and India appear on the chart for the first time. When do they appear on the chart? Russia and India, or certainly India, where does it appears on the chart for the first time in it appears in 1916, 1917, and then we see in 2013 it has jumped, which means there has been an improvement. And remember, India and China were the two BRICS nations that had succeeded. And again, between 2013 and 2019, China has maintained its position. And in fact, in from 2000 to 2013, early 2000s prosperity, China jumps, as you can see there. And in the same way, we see India jump a little bit later. Brazil, a much slower climb. Russia lagging behind because it's a economy reliant on resources. Sources 4, 5 and 6 reveal that since 2015, while India and China have retained their economic power, India rises from 10th to 7th. Russia and Brazil are either stagnant, okay, and Brazil drops from 7th to 8th. So we can see from 2000 basically through to 2019, Brazil and Russia either drop, as you can see there, or they remain stagnant, whereas India jumps and China retains her position. How do the sources differ? Sources 4 and 5 state that Russia and Brazil relied on commodity prices, but 6 does not provide this information. Because 6 is a table, it doesn't make any comments about where these countries' wealth came from. It only states their relative position. So there's no information there. Source 4 explicitly states that commodity prices dropped. None of the other sources, even source 5, make this statement. Okay, they talk about how wealth was built, but not how it dropped. I want to move on to question 5. And question 5 asks us to examine source 2. I'll just come back to it. Okay, and what are the strengths and limitations of using political speeches? This is an interesting one here. Let's have a look at it. So what are the strengths? Well, we know a political speech is designed to strengthen the power or position of the politician making the speech. It is not a statement designed to be accurate or objective, so it's therefore likely to be biased. In source 2, we find this when the president describes the actions of Iraq's president as an unprovoked invasion. So it's an example of him making the statement. The language is subjective, as we stated earlier. It's designed to appeal to American people, to make them feel angry and to commit to a war, which is what happened with the first Gulf War. It's therefore unreliable as an historical source and when it comes to describing the cause of the war. It does, however, provide valuable information about the type of politics that was practiced in the 1990s and how governments attempted, through propaganda, like speeches, to sway their people, to get them to behave a certain way or to support a certain action. If we look at source 5 is useful because it provides general information on the BRICS nations in the early 2000s. It brings together a range of facts in one accessible source. It is a summary, and while it leaves out a large amount of information, it does provide a valuable oversight. But we must remember that even with this article, we need to be careful because Time Magazine is not a charity and it's not a government agency. It's a commercial enterprise. And therefore, like all commercial enterprises, it will produce material, films or articles, in this case an article, designed to appeal to its readers. And we must remember that as an historian, this is directed at American readers. It may withhold information that is not necessarily positive about the United States, It may also not cover material that as an historian I would necessarily be interested in. So again, because it is a commercial document, we need to be careful. The motivation of the writer is important. The writer could have been told, don't talk about Germany, don't talk about Western countries, focus only on BRICS, don't mention the behaviour of certain countries in cutting prices to these nations, the prices that they paid for commodities and the like. And what the writer of the article chooses to include or leave out represents what he thinks his readers are interested in. It does not necessarily include what I need as an historian to write an example, a paper on the BRICS nations. So I've got to be careful of Ian Bremmer's article. Last question is, explain whether you disagree or agree that the New World Order will bring economic growth or cooperation to the global community. This is the last question, so it asks you to bring all of these sources together and to give an overall assessment. So if you have a look at the idea, first off you need to decide overall, do the majority of documents of sources here together point to a more cooperative world? So you need to decide that, and then you go through each one. Source number 1 reflects the bulk of the human race, not those living in North America, Australasia and Western Europe, the old NATO and Western countries. And it talks about them starting to recognise the world in the direction and the overwhelming majority of mankind expects and needs. So this talks about greater democracy in the whole planet. So maybe that is a sign of increased growth and economic growth and cooperation between countries. So maybe number 1 is positive. Number 2 is a justification for war. And this is the speech by President George Bush. Now, it is negative in that it talks about conflict and it talks about violence and the like. You could argue, though, that in some places it does bring together the idea that, unlike in the past, groups of disconnected nations, and I'm seeing here, looking at the bottom paragraph, nations that previously had no allegiance to each other necessarily, no connection, were willing to come together for a cause. Now, the justification of the cause can be argued, but maybe it does mean that nations are more cooperative with each other. So sources 1 and 2, to a degree, maybe support the contention that the New World Order will bring economic growth and cooperation for the global community. Although source 2, you must mention, is a call to war, which points at less cooperation and less understanding in the world. Sources 4, 5 and 6, starting with the infographic and moving on to the 2 articles, talk about economic growth, increased economic power for some countries, which means that they are coming together. But at the same time, the sources also point to the fact that these countries are still splitting amongst themselves and that poverty remains an issue. Source 3, coming back to source 3, we didn't discuss this. This is less reassuring. This source, this infographic, doesn't point to world cooperation. It points to ongoing conflict and the armament of the world arming itself with nuclear weapons. So that's definitely not a positive aspect. And in fact, you could argue that there are now more nuclear nations than there were during the Cold War. So source 3 certainly stands out in contrast. Source 6 reveals that it will be more difficult for the New World Order to replace the old system, because we can see that countries like the old system, as opposed to countries of the New World, BRICS if you like, retain their power. So while China has grown, the United States, Japan, Germany, France and the UK at 5, swapping with 5, at positions 5 and 6, have retained their power and their dominance. So there's an example of how, or some key ideas that you can use when you undertake the source analysis. All the best with it, and remember to send me an email if you have any questions about it. All the best. Thank you.